Welcome, welcome, a really warm welcome to everybody. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, whomever you are, a really warm welcome. So, as you know, we'll start with a guided meditation and just taking this opportunity to maybe fully arrive at this moment. Bringing a sense of presence, a sense of aliveness to the body. Inhabiting the body in some kind of way. There might be portions of the body, areas of the body that feel neutral, and there might be some that feel a bit tight or tense or otherwise calling for attention. And can we, in a warm-hearted way, just bring our attention to those areas where there might be some tightness, some contraction. This can be commonly in the face, around the eyes and the jaw. Sometimes the shoulders get tight and raised up. Can we allow the shoulder blades to slide down the back? And feeling grounded, feeling connected to whatever we're sitting on, whatever the feet are touching, and whatever the hands are touching. Maybe they're touching the top of the legs, maybe each hand is touching the other hand. And then can we rest our attention on the sensations of breathing, noticing this aspect of the body. Feeling the expansion and contraction associated with inhales and exhales. allowing ourselves to rest in the rhythm of the breath. Can we soften any ideas that things need to be different, and instead just rest here with the sensations of breathing? And when the mind finds itself being busy with thought, just very simply, gently begin again with the sensations of breathing. There might be a lot of momentum to our thinking. Chances are you've been thinking all day. So can you have a warm-hearted attitude towards the mind, wanting to continue thinking? We don't have to make thinking a problem. And we just bring it back to the sensations of breathing. Giving ourselves over to the sensations of breathing. Right now, there isn't anything else to do while you're here meditating, nowhere else to be. We're just here, meditating, being aware of the sensations of breathing. can be helpful to make a quiet mental note when we find ourselves thinking. There might be a way in which labeling it, making a note, thinking, like indicates a clear transition from thinking back to the sensations of breathing. This is a tool you can use if it's helpful. If it is not helpful, there's no need to do this practice. But it can be a support, just a soft, gentle note in the mind, thinking. We don't have to make thinking be a problem. We can fold it into our meditation practice. We're not trying to make thoughts go away. We're just choosing to put our attention on the sensations of breathing. Sometimes we might have this idea that meditation is about having no thoughts. And having that kind of idea just creates the conditions for frustration and disappointment. There's a lot of thinking that happens in our daily lives, and that of course continues into our meditation. So is there a way that we can work with our thoughts rather than insisting that they go away? Can we fold them into our practice, and maybe even they can be an ally, they can be a support for our practice? So in this way, our warm-heartedness, our intention to quiet the mind, settle the mind, can be a support, not only for us, but for those who are in contact with us, so that we are more aware of our thoughts and aren't as pushed around by them, so that we may meet others with openness and ease, so that our practice is a benefit not only for ourselves, but for others, and can spread out from there. So may our practice be for the benefit of all beings, everywhere. Welcome, welcome. Really warm welcome. So today I'd like to talk a little bit about thinking and meditation. Often the meditation instructions, or certainly mindfulness instructions, are just to notice our thoughts. And that's a fantastic practice, and it can be very effective, and it's a great way to go. But it's not the only way to work with thoughts, and maybe sometimes something a little bit different is needed. So, can we work with the thinking mind in a way that goes beyond just being mindful of thoughts when the occasion arises, but to use the mind as an ally and use it as a support for our practice?